Department of Russian and Soviet Studies and has been a member of the Polish Academy of Sciences. He earned his undergraduate or his master's degree from the Jagiellonian University and his PhD from the Polish Academy of Sciences. He's published broadly, both in the academic and the popular spheres. He describes himself also as a public intellectual and has listed over 120 political and cultural articles, reviews, and interviews of various kinds. Please join me in welcoming our distinguished guest today, Professor Novak, please.
Thank you very much for this invitation and this introduction. It is really a great honor and privilege for me to be here in this wonderful place among such a distinguished group of scholars and students. I intended only to greet a few of you whom I have honored to know personally. I would like to greet Professor Krawczenko and Professor Morzejko, whom I was introduced myself a minute ago. But of course I would like to greet everybody here in this hall. Actually the subject of my today's not lecture, but a kind of invitation to a discussion, this is how I understand my goal here, is connected not with history, but rather, as I understand it, with contemporary grave situation in Russia, and especially on its western, so to speak, the perimeter on its western borderlands. The problem of Russian imperial expansion, which seemed to be maybe 10, 15 years ago only a historical problem, now is again, unfortunately, discussed not only among scholars, historians, but also among ordinary people. Not just in Eastern Europe, not just in Ukraine and Poland or Latvia, Lithuania or Moldova, but throughout Europe, even here, as I understand, it's a topic of headlines. Trying to present very succinctly the main goals of Russian imperial expansion, I cannot dwell really upon historical sources. Maybe I will pass instead to books which I consecrated to particular subject of historical sources of Russian imperialism, both of course in English. You may look inside if you want, and if you are interested, you may ask publishers for a copy. Even though I would like not to stay on historical issues, it is impossible to leave them out completely from our picture. Because if I would like to enumerate the most important motives that drive, so to speak, Russian imperial expansion today, I should mention history of Russia as one of them, and an important factor among the whole list of factors motivating contemporary Russian imperialism. This is history of traditionally authoritarian rule that developed especially since Moscovian times, since 15th century, and kept moving, so to speak, this particular political system for the next 5 centuries in different, of course, versions, in different ideological guises and in different political and social systems. But this authoritarian element was almost all these 5 centuries quite visible. Stephen Kotkin, for example, stressed this element in one of his broad overviews of the area studies consecrated to Eurasia, that in comparison with its Western neighbors, Russia tends to be authoritarian throughout actually the last 500 years. And of course there are many other studies I don't want to call them out to your attention now. What is more important, however, it is a historical experience that turned into an element of ideology absorbed, so to speak, by the Russian public. Not, of course, by all Russians, but by majority of this public, and which has been engraved by state propaganda, both in the Soviet times and unfortunately is being engraved once again by contemporary political propaganda in Russian Federation. The essence of this historical experience is as follows, to put it very briefly. Russia is a separate world, not belonging to the West, not belonging to the East, but is a separate world apart, fighting for its own existence between these two extremely powerful poles. I mean, Europe on one side and Asia, meaning China in the first place, on the other side. And this sandwich-like situation among such powerful poles means for Russia constant fight for its own existence. The main enemy, however, in this fight is put only on one side of this geopolitical experience, namely on the West, not in the East. I will come back to this element later, describing contemporary situation. But for example, when you see one of the most famous Soviet movies, very interesting, and I advise to see this movie to anyone interested also in contemporary Russian politics. I mean Alexander Nevsky by Sergei Eisenstein. You can see how these different enemies of Russia are portrayed in the movie. There is this Asiatic overlord from which the whole movie is starting its action. And there are German invaders representing Latin Western world. The first, that is Asiatic overlord, is portrayed as not so dangerous, not so detrimental to Russia as those whom are portrayed as the enemy, as the mortal danger for Russian identity, that is the West. In that particular movie, the West in Teutonic order garments. This particular experience of fight with the West was stressed by an extra element of religious conflict between Eastern Orthodox heritage of Russia and, of course, the idea of Moscow, the Third Rome. I don't intend to dwell upon this idea because there is no time, but it's still important. It's still important, this identification that Russia is a separate capital of spirituality, of Christian spirituality, that should fight for its own domination over the whole Christian world, fighting especially with Latin version of Christianity, portrayed, of course, as heresy, as something dangerous for the true Christian heritage of Eastern Orthodoxy. And this particular religious historical conflict is perceived and is recreated in hundreds of films, contemporary movies, thousands of articles published in contemporary Russian press as being not overcome any of these days, that this is still a real and most vital conflict which Russia should accept as inevitable and fight this conflict consciously. The other element connected with this conflict, and the last one which I want to mention from the historical perspective, is that particular motive which pertains to political culture. Russian political culture is briefly defined in this word authoritarian. but this authoritarianism was several times actually contested, also in Russian history, either through the influences of liberty, particularly understood by Cossack elements that was overtaken by Russia in 17th century, or in the model of Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, nobleman Commonwealth, Republic, or in the model of Western influences that began to flow more freely into Russia after Peter I introduced his reforms into Russia. So throughout 18th and 19th centuries, creating elements of liberal, Western-oriented intelligentsia, intellectuals in Russia. So this introduced into Russian historical experience another important element, that there is danger from the perspective of keeping this Russian identity apart from the West. There is a danger of internal, I would say, fifth column, as we called this in Eastern Europe, that is of internal diversion introduced by the West into Russia, that liberals, liberalism, all kinds of softening influences onto this authoritarian regime are actually politically manipulated by the West in order to destroy Russian separate identity and Russian capabilities to defend itself, capabilities that are connected strictly with authoritarian model of existence. So all these motives that seem somehow abstract maybe or anachronistic are nevertheless everyday reconstructed, so to speak, on an everyday basis in contemporary Russian media, dominated 100% as regards electronic media, I mean televisions, but also as regards newspapers under Putin's regime. So they provide contemporary Russians with this particular perspective on everyday basis. So when we try to consult, for example, Levada Center data about Russian public opinion in the last few years, we can constantly observe this trend of growing, actually, tendency to accept this authoritarian, non-liberal perspective on Russian history, Russian identity, when ordinary Russians are asked how would they like to see their own fatherland, they most frequently answer powerful and unbeatable, rather than liberal and prosperous. So I don't intend to quote particular data, but they are unfortunately really alarming in this respect and growing in numbers as regards more and more authoritarian perspective on Russian identity and Russian, so to speak, place in the world. Another element which is very important besides history, and now I want to go out from history, my favorite topic, is geopolitics. Contemporary Russia is really placed between powerful poles of political influence. The most active and the most powerful, actually, and the most dangerous to Russia in a longer perspective is obviously China, which is growing in incredibly high speed as regards its economic power, but also in military terms, China is more and more capable of for expansion, for realizing their own imperial ambitions. But China is not in any haste in this particular ambition. And one has to remind that China remembers 1.5 million square kilometers that were taken from China in 1860 by Beijing Treaty between Russia and Imperial Russia and China in the 19th century. So there is at least this 1.5 million square kilometers, I would say, territorial issue between China and Russia. But there are, of course, much more important things at stake. Ratio between Russia and China as regards economy is something like 1 to 5 at the moment. And of course it is changing with every year to the detriment of Russia. As regards demography, it is something like 1 to 10. Of course, Chinese are 10 times more numerous than Russians. I will come back in a moment to demographic factor. The third, another element connected with Asia as a problem for Russia, a geopolitical problem for Russia, is connected with Islam, with Islamic southern borderlands. Of course, this is connected not just with contemporary, very hot issue of fundamentalists in Syria and Iraq, but also with immediate neighbors of Russia, such as Iran, such as, in geopolitical terms, I mean immediate, Turkey, that are going to be more and more numerous as regards demography and more powerful as regards military matters and economic capabilities. The last element connected, but very important, which connected to the Islamic problem for Russia, that must be mentioned here, is internal problem for Russians. Nowadays there is something like almost 20% of the Russian Federation population of Islamic faith, so to speak, or identity. And so now in the Russian Federation, the situation that, so to speak, endangered the very existence of the Soviet Union in its last years, namely the growing number of Islamic people within the Soviet army and Soviet structures, different structures in the final years of the Soviet Union, is recreated again within the smaller Russian Federation due to much higher fertility rate, of course, of Islamic peoples within the Russian Federation. And here we come to demographic problem. This is one of the most important, probably the most important problem that should be taken into consideration when we discuss Russian expansionist goals. As probably all of you know here, Russia has been a country of the most profound demographic catastrophe throughout the past 24 years. Now it's improving a bit in the past 2 years, but nevertheless the losses of the past 25 years are irretrievable. And still demographic prospects for Russia are very pessimistic according to the UN Population Bureau census and prognosis. So to give you one example, around year 2080, according to the UN Bureau of Population, Russian population would be smaller than that of Afghanistan. Could you imagine? In 1979, when the Soviet Union attacked Afghanistan, it was 280 million people living in the Soviet Union and 14 million people living in Afghanistan. That's how it is changing now. So if Russia wants to stay where it is, if Russia wants to withstand the pressure from the East, Russia has to stop its demographical decrease, has to have more people, and not just any people, but people who would be able to withstand also internal pressure from growing Islamic group. This internal tension is becoming the most crucial problem for Russian stability in the next decade or two. So where we are heading with these remarks, one can ask. Actually, Russia needs more Slavic people, and she cannot produce them by herself, so to speak. This is one of the motives that Russia invites Ukraine. I believe that, that it is something really important. Russia needs manpower, not just in military terms, though it is also very important, because according to the latest observations concerning Russian army reforms, there is a growing lack of people, I mean of manpower actually, at the age of 18 and 19, that would be able to fill up the levels of Russian army recruits for each year. This number is still decreasing very rapidly. But of course, this is not just such a short-term problem. This is much longer-term problem. How to survive both internal and external contest, stemming from the East, from Asia, and where to go with this frame of mind perspective for solution of these problems. And before I will enumerate accurate, more or less accurate goals of the Russian imperial strategy now, I should go to the last element among motives of Russian imperial mentality or Russian imperial expansionism, driving this expansionism, besides history, besides geopolitical position and demographical problems. And this is exactly mentality of its rulers. And this is something very important. How they imagine, how they observe, how they perceive the world around. Who are the rulers of Russia? According to a study that was prepared by Stephen White from Glasgow University and Olga Kryshtanovskaya from Russian Academy of Sciences Institute of Sociology, the elite 1,000 top officials in Russia between the year 2000 and 2009, because this is the latest moment they stopped research, were between 40 to 78% among these 1,000 highest officials, ministers, governors, members of Duma, and this kind of top officials, were in one or another step of their career members of KGB, GRU, SVR, or FSB, one of these four institutions that form actually one particular body of secret services or special services of formerly totalitarian, now authoritarian regime. And this is really a unique situation in the world. No other country was ruled in the history by this kind of elite from secret services forces. And especially of the ex-totalitarian secret services. Because of the special training that is necessary for this kind of people, this particular data that were given by Professor White and Olga Kryshtanovskaya are really important to understand contemporary Russian expansionism. And not just its goals, but more importantly, its methods, its instruments that are used. Because what was taught, what is taught to any adept of Russian secret services, probably like to any other secret services, how to manipulate the enemy and how to eliminate the enemy, sometimes physically eliminate. That's how they are trained. So, what are the enemies from this perspective? Well, the enemies are, in the first place, those who can immediately endanger the position of this particular elite. And now I would like to go to the first, so to speak, goal of contemporary Russian expansionism. The first goal would be the most immediate, the shortest range goal, would be to keep Putin in power. That's all. That's why the expansion begins. When we try to recollect something very near in time, like the year 2012, the beginning of the year 2012, we may recollect exactly the situation when this part of more liberal opinion, Western-oriented opinion in Russia, expressed itself in powerful demonstrations against Putin's regime, right after the falsified Duma elections and then during the president elections in the late 2011 and early 2012. Something like 300,000 people participated in different cities in these particular manifestations. One can say not a big deal for such a big country, but for Putin's regime it was something like a red light, something that showed that there is a possibility of internal crisis. And Putin knows probably better than anyone else that economic and social, so to speak, reasons for this crisis would be rather growing than dissipating itself. These social and economic roots are connected with the main source of Russian stability now, namely money from oil and gas export. As long as Russia can provide its own ambitious goals, but also its own population with some share of this huge money gathered from export of gas and oil, as long this stability can be also provided to Russian internal scene. But the situation is not so, I would say, as regards prospects for Russian oil and gas export, so blooming. That's why Putin reacts looking for a possibility of diverting Russian public opinion from possible crisis. And he knows better than anyone else that there are other KGB, SVR, FSB men around him who would be very happy to eliminate him, if not physically, then at least politically. Actually, in any moment of internal crisis, in any moment when people would gather on streets and someone would ask to shoot into them, this kind of another kind of crisis could provide a change of political leadership in Russia. And of course Putin doesn't want to allow this situation to happen. That's why he uses this very old imperial method that was called by internal minister of Russian imperial government in 1904, Vyacheslav Pleve, Malenkaya pobjedonosnaya wojna, a little victorious war. And one upon a time, this kind of little victorious war was waged against Georgia. But it was not victorious enough. Georgia was not conquered. Russian army was stopped by the European Union and American political diplomatic intervention. Now this little victorious war is waged against Ukraine. You remember, probably all of you, how the first little victorious war that Russia intended to wage, that is against Japan in 1904, ended for the Russian Empire. I am no prophet to say whether this Ukrainian war would end in the same result for Putin as for Nicholas I's war from 1904-1905 would end. But, well, we'll see. Of course, this short range, so to speak, the reason for launching offensive against Ukraine overlaps onto a more, I would say, medium-range goal connected with invasion of Ukraine. This more medium-range goal is exactly demography, which I mentioned. Russia needs Ukrainians turned back, as Russia perceives its relations with Ukrainian population, to turn Ukrainians back to Russia. Not just Ukraine to Russia, but Ukrainians into Russians again. Is it possible, after the last 24 years of independent Ukraine, after several centuries of developing of Ukrainian identity? Of course, it is not possible in every corner of Ukraine. But when we consider this, for example, interesting appeals issued by such controversial but still important politicians in Russia, like Vladimir Zhirinovsky, who offered to Poland, you can take Western Ukraine. It happened just 3 months ago, this offer. It means that, Putin and his regime understands that it is absolutely beyond Russian possibilities and range to assimilate Western Ukraine. But about the rest, well, maybe it will be possible. That's how I'm trying to portray, of course, not my point of view, but Putin's point of view and his advisors. So, of course, this advancement of Russian aggression along southern border of Ukraine, along the Black Sea shore, goes exactly through the territories where this assimilation could be relatively the easiest. The rest of Ukraine could be terrorized with this offensive and, so to speak, persuaded, that's how I understand Russian strategy in this particular direction, persuaded that Ukraine is not a viable political system anymore, losing province after province and not providing enough stability inside. Russia has many tools to provide instability into Ukraine still, especially when Ukraine is left alone vis-à-vis Russia without any real help from the EU, Poland or any Western neighbors. So that's why I perceive this particular element of Russian expansion towards Ukraine. Of course, Belarusia fate would be easily sealed along the expansion towards Ukraine. Though at the moment the situation of western march of the Russian Empire as this particular statehood, I mean, of Belarusia, could be interpreted in long-term goals of Putin's regime, could be prolonged because Russia doesn't need to go into Belarusia in order to use Belarusia as its buffer, as its underlink, as its, so to speak, as I identified it, as its western march. But is it all? Of course not. Ukraine is also very important in terms of economic strategy for Russia in order to gain preponderance over not just former Soviet zone of influence, but over all Europe. This is the real goal, the most advanced or the longest goal of Russian imperial strategy. To take preponderance, to take influence, to have influence in all Europe. Not just Eastern Europe, not just East Central Europe, but all Europe. What does it mean and how it could be done actually, such an ambitious goal? And why? The reason why is easiest to answer actually. It stems from geopolitical situation. Russia would be never able to launch any offensive policy to the east, against China, against Islamic countries. It is beyond its, Russian capabilities, demographic, economic, military capabilities. Russia can stay there only on its defensive position. As regards the West, this is the place where Russia meets with the mildest opposition, with the mildest countermeasure to its imperial goals. And this pertains not just to, let's say, former Soviet zone and its military or economic capabilities, but it also pertains to Central and Western European capitals of former empires, such as Berlin, such as Paris, and such as Rome, especially these three. How they are connected to Russian imperial goals? Well, first through the economic leverage, through oil and gas export, and its most ambitious projects, such as Nord Stream, which, of course, you know what's this? This huge pipeline through the Baltic Sea that connected Russia with Germany, not only in terms of pipeline connection, but more importantly, connection, political economic connection, with its symbolic, so to speak, head of Gerhard Schroeder as one of directors of this particular project, hired by Vladimir Putin. It was really a symbolic gesture that Russian company could hire former Chancellor of Federal Republic of Germany, hire as a normal employee, just with 1 million euros salary per year. So, of course, Gerhard Schroeder is not particularly important in this regard. More important are huge German firms and interests engaged not only in, like Ruhrgas, in this particular project, but in several other projects connected with collaboration, economic, I would say quite natural collaboration between Germany and Russia. Sometimes this collaboration takes quite unusually shape of military collaboration, like the contract signed in 2011, actually May 2011, between Rheinmetall, Gesellschaft, and Russian Ministry of Defense, where Rheinmetall was offered to build a special training for artillery, Russian artillery, for 500 million euros, €500 million, the most advanced technologically training, so to speak, maneuvers center for the Russian army. Besides, just one remark, this particular project was stopped by Chancellor Merkel just a month ago, due to political obvious reasons, because it went too far, I would say, military collaboration between Germany and Russia. So this is predominantly, Russian-German economic collaboration, and Russian influences going via this collaboration are predominantly connected to Nord Stream, to gas export, to collaboration between Gazprom and Ruhrgas, and many other, of course, German companies. Another arm that embraces Europe in this great gas, oil, but especially gas project of Russia is South Stream, that was initiated in 2007 and was finally signed and put into construction in 2011 with the signature of Prime Minister Vladimir Putin at that time and Silvio Berlusconi at Sochi in May 2011. Of course, Italy was not the only one partner for Russia in building South Stream. Also Greece, Serbia, Bulgaria participated in this project. Now Hungary, unfortunately, too. But Italy was the most important due to its position in the European Union and in Western Europe, so to speak, in general. And again, Silvio Berlusconi, portraying himself as the best friend of Vladimir Putin, is not especially important, like Gerhard Schroeder. What is important is the engagement of great Italian firms in this profitable contract, like Eni, for example, engaged for several billion of euros in this particular project. And again, this economic collaboration turns into military collaboration when Italian producers were asked to provide Russia with the most modern transport vehicles for combat forces to change old BTRs, Soviet time BTRs. And of course we have France engaged both in South Stream and in many other economic endeavors connecting its firms with Russia, but also providing Russia with most modern warships type Mistral, which are intended obviously to invade either countries on the Baltic Sea or on the Black Sea, that is either against Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia or Poland, or against Georgia or Ukraine on the Black Sea. There is no other possibility to use this particular warships, only against these countries. That is how they are devised. And unfortunately, France is not that determined as Chancellor Merkel to stop this particular contract. So I'm depicting now, I would say, quite natural tool of Russian expansion used in order to turn Western European partners, economic partners, into political elements of Russian expansionism, appeasement from the Western Europe perspective. And, well, to a degree it works. When you read European newspapers nowadays, you can see how many protests there are from economic angle of opinion against any sanctions against Russia. They are obviously detrimental to many Western European, German, Italian, French firms. They are not enthusiastic about that. That's normal. And that's how it was devised by Russia. But this element of Russian strategy is not the only element of influencing Western Europe. There are also many other factors which I cannot describe in particular. I would mention only just two more. One of them is to use anti-Americanism as a tool of influencing Western European public opinion, especially in France and in Germany, at least in these two particular countries where anti-Americanism is very, I would say, vivid. Russia portrays itself as the only force that can withstand American pressure and that can go against American, so to speak, directorate of world affairs, and to help to gain or regain Western Europe independence vis-à-vis the United States. So this is one element of this great game of influencing Western Europe, especially left-wing, so to speak, zone of public opinion. But there is also another, the opposite, so to speak, element of influencing Western European opinion. Quite unexpectedly, in the last few years, Putin began to play on conservative, a very hard conservative note. I am the only one defender of Christianity against this rotten Western European liberalism, which is portrayed in homosexual marriages, in gender studies, and so on and so forth. I don't want to enumerate this kind of propaganda examples that are used by Putin in order to contrast itself as the defender of conservative values against this rotten West. But also he portrays himself, but only for abroad use, not obviously for inside, so to speak, audience, as the only strong man to withstand Islamic pressure. Of course, inside Russia it would be really catastrophic to use this kind of propaganda portraying Putin as anti-Islamist. While on the external use, Putin uses this quite effectively. Fragments of his speeches addressed to Western journalists, where he suggests that Islamic minorities could be curbed, should be curbed somehow, and he knows how to do this. So from these two angles, Putin regained something that was an important tool of Soviet expansionism, that is, effective ideological instruments influencing Western European or Western public. Left-wing, as it used to be, communism is not viable as this instrument, obviously, but still anti-Americanism is. But now it was added on the extreme right-wing Western European public opinion also. So you have, unfortunately I have to stay with these examples of Russian expansionist movement tools used vis-à-vis Western Europe. But in conclusion, I would like to mention maybe last final element, especially visible now, that is military element of this particular expansionism. Of course, when Russia launched huge military reform in 2008 and launched new, very ambitious modernization program of its offensive capabilities in 2011, for 9 years, Russia provides this program with $700 billion, which is not a little sum, actually. This is several times more than all European countries combined give for all military affairs during that period, I mean 9 years period. Some observers are nervous enough to ask the question whether Putin prepares himself and Russia for a war against NATO, against the United States. My, of course, very timid answer, and maybe an element of a discussion also, would be to say no. Putin is not ready, and Russia would not be ready for any full-scale war against NATO. But Putin uses his huge armaments, his, for example, blue water navy capabilities, his nuclear weapons launched from a new type of submarines, especially Bulava program for this new rockets launched from submarines. This is all intended not to be used against America, I believe, but also, only to intimidate. To intimidate whom? Western Europe and the United States to a degree too, because it should present Russia as the enemy for the United States that could be eliminated only at the highest cost, unimaginable cost, in order to persuade Americans to leave Europe alone. To leave Europe alone vis-à-vis Russia, of course. And to persuade, before that, Europeans, Western Europeans, that whenever Russia chooses its weaker victims, like Ukraine, like Estonia, like Latvia, or like Lithuania, like Moldova, I'm enumerating now only the closest, so to speak, points on this list of possible Russian expansionism victims, that at any such an assault against these countries, Western Europe would not dare to react effectively, only with mild sanctions, predominantly with words, but with no effective help, especially military help, for these particular countries. So, in the final remark, I would like to recollect two statements from the last 10 days. 10 days ago, President Putin stated, and it was published in almost every European newspaper, that his army can be in Warsaw in 2 days. Well, probably he's right. And yesterday, German defense minister declared that Germany would not be able to realize its obligation in NATO plans to give help to any attacked country within 180 days. So even within 180 days, Germany would not be able to provide any effective help due to problems with its equipment, its modernization, and so on and so forth. And this is exactly how Putin could build up his hopes that his plan to intimidate Western Europe, to take Eastern Europe first, and then to use Western Europe in his great game for Russian survival vis-à-vis China, Islam, and Russian, so to speak, role as a global power again, could be realized. How can we stop these dreams? This is probably a good topic for our discussion. So thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Professor Novak. Would you be willing to take questions and discussion?
Absolutely.
Okay, so let's go.
Thank you for your insightful presentation. We met several times in various countries, and I'm glad you managed to find your way to Edmonton. But my question is very simple. What about Poland? What about Polish attitude towards Russia?
Yeah. Oh, that's a very delicate subject because I am, well, one of these people that criticize very openly Polish government policy towards Eastern Europe nowadays. Actually, I like especially this particular picture from Ukrainian Weekly, which I would like to pass, portraying President Putin and our former Prime Minister Donald Tusk shaking hands under the title The New Warsaw Pact. It is from 2010, but this kind of New Warsaw Pact was in existence actually to this year, in effect. So I think that there are different periods of Polish foreign policy towards Eastern Europe. Up till 2007, 2008 actually, there was a consensus among different groups of Polish political spectrum that the most vital element of Polish stability on the map is independent Ukraine. That's why Ukraine should be the first to be helped, to be a partner for Polish foreign policy, even though there are sometimes problems, as usually among neighbors. So be it post-communist government or liberal government, all prime ministers from these governments, whenever they were introduced into their offices, their first visit to the east was always to Kiev or sometimes to Vilnius. Only with the assent of Prime Minister Donald Tusk, he decided to change 100% this policy and to declare that now only Russia is our partner. We should forget about this old idea of Polish-Ukrainian partnership and to show Russia that we are not anti-Russian anymore, which means that he visited President Putin first at the moment when Russia blackmailed Ukraine, exactly at the moment when Russia blackmailed Ukraine for gas, with gas stoppage. It was February 2008. And this government tried to dissociate as visibly as possible from Ukraine all the time, which I think was very detrimental to Polish stability, and not just to Ukraine but for Poland in the first place. Even after the catastrophe of the plane with Polish president, this government decided to leave all, I would say, elements connected with this catastrophe in hands of these, sorry but I cannot find any other appropriate word, henchmen, as were doing at the same time with Sergiej Magnitsky, with Anna Politkowska. I mean just the judicial top officials of the Russian Federation at that time. These were exactly the same people who were to decide what happened at Smolensk in April 2010. It was a kind of, once again, stress that Moscow is the most important, Ukraine is not important anymore. And actually, there was a sequence of very important achievements of Putin's policy in 4 days. April 7th, visit of Prime Minister Donald Tusk at Smolensk, which was divided from Polish president visit. So division into Poland, driven into Poland between President and Prime Minister was first success. Then it was April 8th when President Medvedev opened officially Nord Stream. April 9th when President Medvedev dined with President Obama in Prague, declaring new phase of Russian-American friendship, and April 10th catastrophe at Smolensk with this group of Polish politicians that were against this policy. And of course, several days later, there was this special agreement between Russia and Ukraine, President Yanukovych extending Russian possession of Sevastopol to 2042. Now it is, of course, so to speak, solved in another way. So I'm coming back to these particular events as a kind of co-referat to what I said before, because it aches me really. It is something that makes me angry that my country decided to act against its own particular interest and against interest not just of Eastern Europe, but I would say against the interest of Europe. That is to change Russia. If we want to have another Russia, Russia where liberals put into the very corner now and terrorized now, to be more, I would say, active and to encourage them, we have to stop at some point Putin and his version of Russia. And my government, Polish government, decided to withdraw from this policy, enabling Putin his next successes. So nowadays the position of our government has changed a bit due to dramatic situation in Ukraine and obvious unpopularity of such an attitude as it used to be introduced vis-à-vis Moscow in this situation. But I would say that no real changes, no real effective changes were introduced into Polish Eastern policy. Poland, the Polish government has not decided to change effectively the course that was taken in 2008. And now this course is more, I would say, defensive, more passive, but I wouldn't lean on Poland if I were Ukrainian now, unfortunately. Yes, please.
My name is Peter. My question is, one of the things I recently heard from some of my Russian friends here in Canada is that it is very common for Russians, especially Russian women, to marry Chinese men. And it is a significant trend. I'm just wondering, well, have you heard about this, and do you know what's issue, and how that can influence this relationship between Russia and China, and is it something that Russia could potentially benefit from this mixed population looking into the future, or is it something that could be to the detriment to Russia?
Okay, thank you. I think this is rather a problem connected with the Asiatic part of Russia, but of course this is where the Russian-Chinese relations are the most sensitive. There are also estimates that tell us that there are as much as 5 million illegal Chinese migrants into Russian Federation, Asiatic part of Russian Federation, while there are only 28 million inhabitants of this Asiatic Russia taken together. So if these estimates are accurate, and this I cannot actually check, then it would mean that there are already 1/5 or 1/6 of all population of this huge territory is Chinese. And an element of this picture is exactly what you stated, that many Russian women decide to marry Chinese, not only due to, I would say, their physical attractiveness. I don't know about Russian women, so to speak, preferences in this respect. But there are more, I would say, objective social reasons for that. Unfortunately, Russian men in high percent are prone to the problem, alcoholic problem, which is much more, I would say, frequent than among Chinese men. And another element which is important, the huge problem on the Chinese side, which undermines Chinese stability, that there are 50 million more young men in China than young women, due to one-child policy in China and probably hundreds of millions little girls killed in China. So for Chinese, so to speak, candidates for husbandry, they have to look outside China for their wives, and it has its political effect. Probably not important for husband and wife, but in social dimension, it is exactly the effect you mentioned. Another element of China, relatively peaceful expansion into Eastern Siberia.
I think there was a hand over here. Do you have your hand up? Yes, please.
Poland was mentioned as a policy that is still sort of waffling. And could you elaborate a little more about the policy of Lithuania, Estonia, to what extent there's a coordination among the Baltic states vis-a-vis Russia and vis-a-vis Ukraine, and also with Poland?
Actually, I think that there is no real coordination between the Baltic states, though there are elements of this coordination between, for example, Estonia and Sweden, which is very important. Sweden and Estonia are the only NATO countries that have a specific military agreement, because no other NATO members have this kind of bilateral military agreements, because we feel that NATO is enough. Estonians probably feel different, that it is not enough, and probably they are right. And Swedes understand Estonians, so to speak, fears. That's why Stockholm decided, especially under the guidance of Carl Bildt as the key political thinker and doer in Stockholm, that it is worthwhile to sign such a treaty with Estonia. As regards Lithuania, unfortunately, good days of Polish-Lithuanian collaboration are over. They were really very close between 2005 and 2008, between President Valdas Adamkus and President Lech Kaczynski. Nevertheless, contemporary political elite in Lithuania perceives this political situation with Russian expansionism quite seriously, and Daria Grybauskaite presents really hard position vis-à-vis this danger, much harder than any contemporary Polish government politician. And Latvia is probably in the most shaky situation due to the numbers of Russian minority, up to 30%. And Putin declared quite recently, in the last week, his officials, that this could be really used now, I mean Russian minority. That's why I would say that Latvia is a bit paralyzed with this fear of internal collapse. So probably these are the most important element of my picture of the problem you asked. But I would like to stress that I still hope that Poland would change her policy and would sober in its relation to both Baltic states in order to organize more effective collaboration with these states and to use possible links with Sweden, and also would be able to influence our southern neighbors to change their attitude. I mean, especially Hungary now, Slovakia now, that are very pro-Russian, both countries, and mildly pro-Russian Czech country, especially Czech President Miloš Zeman.
Which is the greater problem for Russia, the Chinese or the Muslim world?
Oh, that's a very difficult question, of course, but it seems to me that Islam is much more important because it's internal problem already, and not just in Eastern Siberia, but inside Moscow, inside all great cities of Russia, and inside all this southern belt of European Russia, not just Asiatic Russia. So because of its internal element, of course we mentioned that Chinese problem is also to a degree an internal problem, but it is more distant. Also in time, China don't declare any aggressive, so to speak, policy against Russia at this moment, and I think that probably in the next several decades China would not decide to swallow Russia. She can do it anytime later. While with Islam the problem is much more urgent, and Russia cannot control it completely. That's why, to answer briefly, I would say probably Islam is more important for Russia.
I believe we have time for one more question. Did you have a question?
Yeah, I wonder if you could expound on the Russian Crimea dilemma. When this Crimea thing first arose, I immediately got to thinking of it in the Canadian context. What would the Canadian government and Canadian public's reaction be if in the case of Quebec separation, Northern Quebec they decided to remain with Canada? It seems to me that the Crimean problem is somewhat different from Soviet troops rushing into the eastern Ukraine. Is that as it currently done? Do you see that in those terms as well, or are they different problems?
Of course, I'm no expert in Quebec, but it seems to me that when you compare Quebec to Crimea, the real situation in Crimea, the difference would be that, do you imagine French soldiers under civilian, so to speak, guys intervening in Quebec and uniting Quebec with France, not declaring the independence of Quebec from Canada, but reunification of Quebec with France. Then I would say the situation would be similar to that of Crimea, but probably you meant something else. So this was not a will of indigenous people of Crimea to go to Russia. First of all, because indigenous people are Tatars that were expelled by Stalin in 1943 and Russian colonies were introduced, Russian and to a degree Ukrainian colonies were introduced instead of these indigenous inhabitants of Crimea. And only with the end of the final years of Perestroika, Tatars were able to, partially at least, to come back to Crimea. And as you probably know, most of Tatars were against Russian, so to speak, demands to take back Crimea. Most of Tatars backed, and overwhelming majority of Tatars backed Ukrainian state, treating Ukraine as at least lesser evil. If not good, then at least lesser evil. Besides, as regards Russian population of Crimea, besides Sevastopol, there were no signs of, I would say, civic disobedience of these Russian inhabitants of Crimea prior to Putin's decision to take Crimea. In 2013, 2012, 2011, there were no Russian riots, no Russian manifestations on a larger scale, of course, except Sevastopol. Of course, Sevastopol is a specific case, really a Russian city, one can call it in these plain terms, but not all Crimea. So this is, I would say, more complicated than just like Quebec, at least from my perspective.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Novak.
Thank you.
I'd like to also remind you and invite you all cordially to our Central European Cafe on Friday. And with that cafe at 2 o'clock, just 2 doors down the hall, we'll be discussing a joint project we have with the Canadian Institute for Ukrainian Studies, and that is an upcoming conference on the internment of Austro-Hungarians during the First World War. So you're all cordially invited. Coffee, cakes, Friday. See you.